Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and today we're going to do something a little different. No interview today. I want to do a Halloween special. I've only done one other Halloween episode. That was back in 2022. And I'm going to actually bring some of that audio over to today's episode, some of the audio that I felt was really interesting and worth repeating. But there'll be some new stuff as well. And today I want to talk about horror movies. And interestingly, a lot of vegans like horror movies, which seems kind of strange or contradictory to me. And I've realized over the years that this is kind of an entire vegan genre with some t-shirt makers like Compassion Company does an entire Halloween themed series. Andy Tabar does all these t-shirts and stickers every year around Halloween themes. And at our recent Sonoma County Veg Fest, we had a new t-shirt vendor, Vegan Power. Alicia is the owner, and she had some horror vegan crossover offerings as well on t-shirts and other products. And just full disclaimer, I don't like or watch horror movies. I used to when I was much younger. I just cannot handle it now. But I'm kind of fascinated by this connection and the psychology around horror, the horror genre, and its connection to animal rights and animal issues. There's actually a lot to explore in that intersection. And I like the thought experiment of what would an alien culture from outside our planet think about some aspects of our human culture, right? And what would they think about horror movies? Why is this a form of entertainment? Watching the most horrific thing that can happen to someone, choosing to watch that, choosing to be scared out of your mind, creating all these different kinds of scenarios where we are just scared to death. What does that say about us? It just seems really bizarre to me. So let's explore some of that and also how it may relate to veganism. So there's two parts to this episode. Both are just about 10 minutes each. And in the first part, I share some thoughts about horror movies that feature cannibalism. And there's actually a lot of those. And I relate this to veganism and particularly to speciesism and the species barrier. In the second part of this episode, you're going to hear from my husband, Cogen. And Cogen and I are kind of having a conversation and exploring this question that I've been thinking about recently. And that is, are humans subconsciously drawn to eating meat because it's a socially sanctioned murder? We talk about horror movies and taboos around killing and how we navigate this psychology as humans. And for that second part, I'm trying something new. My husband Cogen and I love to go on long walks and long drives, and it's because we get into these deep philosophical discussions. Cogen always has really interesting takes on things. He is really knowledgeable on a variety of topics, and it's fun to have deep conversations with him. And then, so we've a couple of times we tried to recreate these conversations on our computers for the podcast, and it's never quite as good. It's never quite as good as when we're relaxed and in our element and on our walks or on a long drive. And he rarely has time to do these recreations anyway. So I thought I would try to just record some of these conversations just spontaneously on the spot. So we were driving back from the Bay Area back to Oregon, and I brought up this question, this concept of why people like horror movies, and could it be that meat eating is a way for people to kind of subconsciously feel like they're getting away with murder? So I recorded our conversation in the car, and the audio quality, it isn't great, right? You hear the hum of the car, but I wanted to share it with you. Now, if you hate it and you think that I should just stick with the long form interviews with good audio quality, like I mostly do, just let me know. I'd like to do more of this though. I want to try this, recording Cogen and I's conversations because we do have these really interesting conversations, but the audio quality just won't be great, right? So I'm just curious if you have a strong opinion about it, one way or the other, let me know. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's get a little creepy and a little spooky and into the spirit of Halloween. And here's the first part of this two-part episode where I share some thoughts about flesh eating, replayed from the 2022 Halloween episode. So, I'm going to start us off today with a discussion about cannibalism in the spirit of Halloween. Now, if you find yourself revolted by the thought of cannibalism before you turn off the podcast and skip this episode, I want you to ask yourself why. Why is talking about cannibalism more disturbing than talking about meat eating or eating animals, which is what we talk about often on this show, right? If you are more revolted by the topic of cannibalism, then I might suggest that you have some unconscious or latent speciesist bias, which we all have. Speciesism, of course, is the assumption of human superiority that leads to the exploitation of non-human animals. And human flesh eating is a really common theme in horror, right? Like zombies, of course, even vampires drinking blood is a form of cannibalism. And there's blatant speciesism around this. There's such a taboo and disgust when it's human flesh being eaten, but not animals. You see this really often in horror movies and horror shows, from just blatant flesh eating, like zombie hordes coming after people and just gnawing on legs and brains, right? But we also see it in more subtle scenes, like in the classic campy cult film Rocky Horror Picture Show, where, well, and yes, I did go to the midnight showings as a teenager of Rocky Horror. I used to dress up like Columbia and act out the scenes with all the audience participation lines. It was so much fun. Do kids do that anymore? Does anyone do that anymore? It was so much fun for freaky kids like me to go to those midnight showings of Rocky Horror. I don't know if people do that anymore. Anyway, so there's this part in Rocky Horror where they're all sitting down to dinner and there's this big slab of meat on each plate, and it's fine and normal, right, when everyone thinks it's animal flesh that they're eating. But Frankenfurter, the main character, gives these subtle hints as to what or who they're eating. And one by one, they kind of start to get it. The characters, the dinner guests, start to kind of get what's going on. And then Frankenfurter gives the big reveal of pulling the tablecloth off the table, and under the glass top table is Eddie, who has been killed by Frankenfurter in an earlier scene, and with hunks like cut out of him. So that's what everyone has been eating. And there's, of course, this, uproar and disgust and horror at the thought of eating Eddie. But when it was a nameless, faceless animal, right, it was no big deal. It was just normal. But this is a common theme in a lot of horror movies. And it's just interesting how when we cross that species barrier, flesh eating goes from a delicious dinner to a horror show, right? Why is it so different? It is our own species, human, so I do get that there is something a little closer to home, that there's certain, there's maybe a certain threat to our own mortality. We feel like it could be us being killed and eaten. But it's so close to animal flesh eating. It's just really interesting that we have normalized this horror of animal flesh eating so that we don't recognize it, the practice, for what it is, for what flesh eating is. We don't recognize it as revolting and sickening and awful until it's human flesh. And not only is it disgusting, but you've taken a life, a sentient animal's life. When it's a human, the act of eating flesh is subversive and sickening and shocking. But when it's animal flesh, only vegans recognize it for that, for what it is. But somehow, as a society, it's been normalized to the point that people don't recognize it in the same way, don't recognize it for what it is, that sickening, shocking practice. But horror movies can really kind of uncover the reality of flesh eating. So the genre of horror and the motif of cannibalism reveals this latent speciesism that everyone has, and they just don't know it. It's fascinating. There's also an interesting speciesist theme in modern vampire movies and shows, and I'm thinking particularly of the Twilight series where there's these bad vampires that drink human blood and kill humans, and then there's the good vampires who only drink the blood of non-human animals. There's even a scene where Edward, the main character vampire of the good vampires, he compares his family to vegetarians because they only kill non-human animals. It's so frustrating again, because we have this species barrier, right? Where the only animal worth protecting is the human animal. If you are killing and drinking the blood of non-human animals, well, then you're just in normal ethical territory. You're no longer a monster. Only monsters kill humans, right? But why? Why is there this vast difference? Is it because humans are conscious? Because humans are sentient? Well, guess what? Non-human animals are conscious and sentient. Is it because humans suffer, we feel pain? Well, animals suffer and feel pain the same as we do. Why? What's the difference? There is a speciesist bias because of the amount of horror we feel in killing and eating humans or drinking their blood versus complete exoneration from killing and eating non-human animals. But I think that all of this, showing this close connection between flesh eating of animals and humans, can also evoke empathy, right? Connecting eating flesh to disgust or it being shocking or repulsive. There's often a meat connection with the location in the horror movies as well. These creepy scenes being in slaughterhouses or meat lockers and meat coolers with the cow, dead cow bodies hanging, right? That's often the location of the killing or where the killer can be found in these movies. So there's this recognition that slaughterhouses are scary places. For who? Right? We're basically subconsciously saying that they are scary places for non-human animals. It's animals that are killed there. So we're admitting that these places evoke fear and dread and are frightening places to be, right? All very interesting. So when we are identifying with the victim in these movies, the fear of having your life threatened and, possibly being tortured or killed in a horrifying way, we're also identifying with the plight of farmed animals. When we empathize with the victim in a horror movie, when we are terrified for what they're going through, we can also empathize with how animals live their short lives every day in fear, with scary people chasing you, torturing you, being electrocuted, cut and killed in gruesome and bloody ways, disemboweled and eaten. I mean, that's a farmed animal's life and death. But people may not realize that that's what they're feeling or that they're feeling the same thing that animals go through. So I'm here to connect those dots, connect that horror and point out that what you feel for a victim of a horror movie, that's what you should also feel for farmed animals, because it's the same. They go through the same things. So, the horror genre around Halloween really presents us with an opportunity, I think, to talk about speciesism in a unique way. More so than any other season or holiday, it's a great opportunity to have these philosophical conversations around flesh eating. But ultimately, I do believe that we will, as a society, eventually all see what vegans see and recognize animal flesh eating for the horror show that it is. I long for that day. I hope for that day. And I think we're getting there. Okay, so that was a little flesh eating and cannibalism content and the connection to animal issues. This next segment, you will hear mostly from my husband, Cogen, and I'm there as well, and we're having a conversation. I asked him to ponder what it is about horror movies that we as a society loves or at least finds intriguing or drawn to, right? And could it be that we enjoy meat eating because it's kind of like a socially sanctioned slasher movie? So horror movies depict mostly murder, right? Maybe torture and murder, essentially the most taboo the things in our society, the worst things that you can do to another being, especially something so intimate like slashing a throat or stabbing with a knife. And this is all very reflective of what we do to animals in the slaughterhouse. So, could it be that on a subconscious level, people feel like eating meat is somehow getting away with murder? These dark urges that some of us have, it's socially or societally sanctioned murder. Just an interesting thought experiment. So, again, the audio quality sucks. We were on a long 9-hour drive, so you can hear the hum of the car and it's kind of buzzy and tingy, but I felt it was an interesting conversation to share. Okay, hope you enjoy it.
Freudian psychology, you have two internal urges. You have the eros, which is like the life urge, and the thanatos, which is the death urge. And the eros is all the things that you do that are life affirming. Like getting your college degree, getting out of bed and exercising, eating healthy. And then the thanatos is like the urge. That's all the sort of self-destructive behavior.
Wait, like Thanos, like in the
yeah,
Marvel movies, he was the bad guy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Except I believe Freud used the thanatos, but it's related.
Well, they just probably.
Yeah, they're somehow related.
The name,
they're certainly the same word, right? Yeah, so we have this sort of internal Thanos, right, or Thanatos. The same way Thanos wanted to destroy half of the universe, Thanatos is our internal urge that wants us to destroy have half of our behavior be destructive. And so these are like these sort of vice urges that we have. So it's like the same thing like when you're a kid, you're attracted to the thing that your parents tell you not to do. As an adult, you're attracted to vices such as intoxicants and alcohol, or behaviors that you know are not good for you, unhealthy eating, staying up late and partying when you know you shouldn't, and that sort of thing. So I think that might be similar to our attraction to horror movies, that sort of attraction to that which you know is bad. It's
taboo.
Yeah, taboo and something that's hurtful and painful. And it's sometimes like when I witness my family eating, they do it with the same sort of pride that George Byrne would with his cigar, or Arnold Schwarzenegger, to sort of flaunt the vice. It's like, look, I'm going to do this thing that's really horrible that the society tells me not to do, and I'm going to do it anyway,
with gusto.
With gusto, and with attitude and bravado, and it becomes sort of this almost machismo. It's kind of the opposite of virtue signaling, right? Like, it's vice signaling.
Vice signaling,
right? It's like vice signaling. It's like, well, I'm going to go ahead and get drunk tonight and pass out, and I'm not going to wake up tomorrow. And, it's like you sort of like brag about how bad you're going to treat yourself or how you're going to do this like horrible thing. I think that's kind of ties into that sort of Thanatos internal death urge. And so we have attractions to things like murder and horror and serial killer and unwholesome behaviors. For the most part, I think it's like a theoretical attraction, for lack of a better term. Like we're willing to watch it as entertainment on the big screen, but most people are not like really attracted to murdering people, or maybe they are, but there's just enough like, other things that would keep that in check.
Yeah. So, but what I'm kind of alluding to is that, I don't know, there seems to be this, like you said, attraction to the dark side, to the negative, right? And here is a socially sanctioned murder, really, a death, a killing. And you can cause a sentient, innocent being intense suffering and death. And it's socially sanctioned. Like, everybody's doing it. It's okay, And so it's a way for us to kind of engage in some pretty, like, I don't know, destructive, taboo kind of behavior is socially sanctioned.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It makes you wonder if we're just a set of social taboos away from it all being murderers.
That's what we thought.
We all enjoy the murdering on, not all of us, I don't like it, but people enjoy horror. And I'm not making a moral judgment of people enjoying, I'm making more of a statement about human nature.
Yeah.
That people enjoy that sort of horror thing, but there's enough social taboos that they can't enact that. But maybe they get that same sort of enjoyment out of the murder of the animal, but it doesn't have the same sort of restrictions.
Yeah, maybe it can all be very subconscious too.
Yeah. Well, it really lends a lot of credence to the argument that really what we need to do to create a vegan world is enact social taboos. That's construction of culture, right? Because one of the main forms of culture is social taboos. What's sanctioned and what's taboo.
Yeah.
And
just why we only eat chickens, pigs, cows, no other animal. Every other animal, it's gross, it's taboo.
Yeah, it's a cultural construction.
Right.
And so and we've seen the cultural constructions work in stopping the killing of other human beings, or in the killing and eating of horses and dogs and whatever.
Right.
So, we can say with equal confidence that if we just had adequate taboos, we could stop people from eating meat in a way that may even be more effective than legislation or these other sort of
means. Because it's ingrained in the fabric of society.
Yeah, we don't need a law to tell people not to eat rat meat or not to eat dogs. People just don't do that.
Yeah.
In some ways, a taboo is a higher order of law than a social law itself. It sort of goes to the heart of what constructs a person's identity. Yeah, I think it's an interesting observation. I think there's also something interesting that might happen to vegans around Halloween. Where we kind of see the whole situation a little differently because of our awareness to the realities of horror. Horror is not just this fantasy that happens on the big screen or on your television. Like, for us, horror is something that we witness our loved ones partake in every day, joyfully partake, with gusto. They enjoy the horror. So I'm thinking about our neighbor who decorated their entire front house with imagery of serial killers and bodies mutilated and arms severed, and how horrified you and I were to witness that. And I don't know if I really made the connection, but perhaps one of the reasons why we're horrified is because we know the realities of a slaughterhouse.
Yeah. And that is actually happening.
Yeah, it's not this
to billions of animals.
It's not this imagined fantasy scenario for us as vegans.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I can generalize with this as vegans, but personally, I think as a vegan, I'm more sensitive to horror because to me, horror is something it's a reality of our society.
Yeah.
I have to wonder if a crime scene investigator who goes to the scene after a serial killer has mutilated a body, if that person goes home and watches horror movies, I seriously doubt it. Probably because horror is more real to them.
Right.
It's not this. It's not this fantasy. And I think that as a vegan myself, I think it's part of the reason why I have an aversion to that type of horror that is on display during Halloween, because that horror is very, very real. And then also you have to wonder if desensitizing people to atrocities against humans, like we do in horror movies or like we do at Halloween with these types of displays, if that makes it that much easier for us to be desensitized to atrocities against animals. So, again, it's hard to make solid generalizations.
Or maybe it makes us more sensitive when we realize that, we would, never want this to happen to anyone. It's such a horrible, awful scenario that, a slasher movie, that this would happen, that someone would slash the throat of a human.
But there's still that.
And then
There's
when you
still
find
that,
out that the animals are going through the same thing, experiencing the same
Yeah,
horror,
yeah.
getting the same slashing of the throat, then maybe you can sympathize with the animals a little more.
Yeah, and maybe that's why like a vegan would enjoy a slasher movie.
Yeah, and there are so many vegans that do.
Yeah, because they're thinking like, look, it's a connection to animal personhood, right?
Huh.
When you realize that the victim of the crime in the horror movie is essentially being treated the same way that everybody in the audience is treating animals.
Yeah.
It's like, I think maybe vegans might hope that connection will be made.
Yeah.
Like when we watch a sci-fi movie, like we may not like horror, but we do like sci-fi.
Yeah.
And the example where some alien comes to our world and exploits human beings the way we exploit animals,
Yeah.
we as vegans are always like, make the connection, make the connection.
Right.
And so maybe something like that can be said for horror movies too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Good point.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. So that was a little something different to highlight in the upcoming Halloween holiday. We'll be back next time with a regular interview style episode, just exploring something different. And just in our last moments, I wanted to share something with you. I wanted to share a creative costume that I made long ago. It was my favorite Halloween costume that I ever came up with. This was back in my 20s, so that would be the 90s. And I created a superhero costume, the Vegan Venus. She was a superhero ready to spread the vegan message. And I had like brown tights and a green leotard. It was like tights and a leotard and a green cape. And you know how Wonder Woman's logo was two W's kind of stacked on top of each other in gold? So I got some gold fabric and I created this. It was like reminiscent of that logo with two V's for Vegan Venus, right? And I sewed that on the back of the cape. And I created a utility belt out of gold rope that had room for vegan literature, for vegan booklets. So that was my weapons, right? That I'd pull out of my utility belt was vegan information. It was really cute. And wow, I wish I had good pictures. We didn't take pictures back then. It was like I could never afford a camera. Cameras were expensive. So yeah, I don't have pictures from back then. I gotta go dig and see if maybe I might have a picture or two of the vegan Venus somewhere. That was a really fun costume, really creative. So I hope you have a really fun Halloween. Get creative with your costume, maybe have a vegan theme, explore all the compassionate candy options, and live vegan.